Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time. Welcome to this webinar that's jointly hosted by the APM's Benefits and Value Interest Networks and the Built Environment Interest Network. In fact, it's the very first webinar that the new Built Environment Network has been involved with. So I'm delighted to be here today. By way of introduction, I'd like you to give a silent welcome to Ellie Jenkins. Ellie's a partner at Akerlof, and she gets involved in all sorts of ESG initiatives on their behalf, helping both private and public sector achieve their goals. So really looking forward to hearing what Ellie has to say, having been instrumental in bringing the Construction Value Toolkit to market. So without any further ado, Ellie, over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Dave. It's really lovely to be here with you all today, although slightly disconcerting that I can't see any of you. But I assume that you're all there and that you're going to come through with some really interesting and challenging questions for me to answer at the end, and do my absolute best to answer any that I can for you. So I've been asked to come and talk to you today about the journey to developing the Value Toolkit. So a little bit about the steps that we went on, and I think any of you that are working in the benefits and value management space will hopefully be able to take some of those lessons, and if you're trying to get support behind a standard or any new way of working, hopefully some of those insights will help. I'll share some of the resources with you and some of the lessons learnt as well. So our aim today, hopefully by the end of the session today, we'll have built a greater understanding around the Value Toolkit, and I'll share with you how it can be used to support your work on major projects in the built environment, both in linear and social infrastructure. I'll tell you a little bit more about the movement behind the Value Toolkit and how that was established and created. And I'll also signpost you to all of the available resources that are now released open source, and they're free to access. So anyone can access them, have a play, see how they might work for your organisation or some of your clients, and just get familiar with those tools and resources. And if we achieve those three things today, then hopefully we'll have done all we need to for this session. So as Dave said, I'm Ellie Jenkins. I'm a partner at a consultancy called Akerlof. And at Akerlof, our mission is to help clients deliver better environmental, social and economic outcomes. And we work with a really wide range of clients, from most of the major consultancies directly to the government departments on major infrastructure projects, particularly in health and related to justice, and then we work developer and investor side as well. And my role is to lead on the environmental and social practice, and we have a very strong tilt towards the S in ESG, so that's where I spend the vast majority of my time. But more than that, I am absolutely committed to ensuring that investments that we make in our built environment unlock the potential that they have for better outcomes for people and planet. And that runs right through my core. It's what I've done for a very, very long time. So on to that topic of a better built environment, because it's really where the Value Toolkit started. And I think one of the things that's a bit complicated and slightly contentious when we look at value and what a better built environment means, we all have very different views on what that means, and stakeholders across the built environment will also have very different views around their expectations. So I shared with you that my work leans into that S. So anything related to social impact and social value is where I spend the vast majority of my time. And that links really naturally to my personal decision making. That I think we want to create environments that are inclusive, that help social mobility, that help drive sort of society forward. Equally, if you had a lens towards the environmental side of things, you would see that a better built environment was one that was green, that had really high levels of green and blue infrastructure, greater biodiversity, and really sat well within its natural setting, enhancing that natural environment rather than depleting it. And equally, for some of you out there, neither of those things will be particularly important. For you, a better built environment will be highly function driven, one that works, that is low maintenance, that is effective to manage as an estate. And I think really what these pictures show is that we all have a very different perspective on what good value looks like for a built environment investment. And that's an important factor to bear in mind, because there isn't one single definition of good value that we can draw across every single investment that we make in the built environment. It will be different every time. So instead, what we need is a framework or steps that help us to effectively to sort of define and decide what good outcomes look like for specific investments that are being made in the context that they're being made. So the challenge, anyone that's worked in this sector for a long time will have heard of the Latham and Egan report. So the Egan report was in 1998, and it said at that point that really the built environment was still failing to deliver better outcomes on time and on budget, and that collectively as a sector, we needed to focus our efforts on delivering better value that reflected customers' needs. Now, I've worked in the built environment for a very long time, and I have seen positive change over that time. We've absolutely made steps in the right direction. That said, the IPA recently, in 2025, released its report on 2023 and 2024 assessments of major infrastructure investments. We're still at a point where the government is only confident that 11% of its major investments in the built environment will deliver its strategic objectives on time and to cost. 84% of those investments have significant issues. Now, to me, that's pretty stark. That's really significant. And it shows that as much as individuals that are out there working every day with clients to help deliver better outcomes, we think we've driven lots of positive change, we're maybe not quite as far on that journey as we'd hope to be. And there are lots of reasons why that's the case. And the Value Toolkit is one thing that helps to unpick one of those strands. So it's a challenge that we've known for decades, and it's a challenge that we've made some improvements on, but nowhere near as much progress as we'd really hoped we would. So where did the Value Toolkit come from? Well, in essence, in the industrial strategy, the last industrial strategy that came out, there was a real focus to drive improvements within the construction sector. And as part of that, Anne Bentley, who was on the board of RLB at the time and worked with the CLC, the Construction Leadership Council, issued a paper called Procuring for Value. And in that, it said we really needed to look at the way we procured our built environment projects to help unlock better outcomes. Now, it's worth saying at this point that the Value Toolkit ended up being a much broader process that runs from very early stages all the way through procurement and through delivery. But it started out with a kind of a focus on trying to help procurement deliver better outcomes. So when we started on this journey, which was 4 or 5 years ago now, we were set kind of 4 tasks to look at how we could establish a framework by which value could be defined, to develop a process to help to support and better inform procurement around outcomes rather than focusing on cost and programme, to build the competency of client advisors and of clients. And I think it's fair to say we did that all the way through the Value Toolkit, and it's one of the reasons that I'm here talking with you today, and to galvanise sectoral support for a different way of working. And I think of all the things that we did around creating the Value Toolkit, that is the one that I think we hit the nail on the head with. We really did manage to create a bit of a movement around a shift away from cost and towards value. So in terms of our approach, there are 4, I guess, spines that sat across our approach to how we went about creating the Value Toolkit. So we had a very small core technical team that were based in expertise in sustainability, innovation, and technical development and engagement. So very small team that worked on the project full time. And then we had a strategy board. So a board of both public and private sector, very senior leaders, policymakers that were able to ensure that we were working in the right direction. The second thing that we knew that was really important was industry backing. And I'm really proud that we had over 400 individuals working from across organisations working on the Value Toolkit throughout its development. And I think that's a testament to how much as an industry we really want to drive that change. So we worked very hard to work across the built environment consultancies, the tier 1s, the sector bodies as well. And I think, again, that was quite a testament to the change that's needed, and that it's accepted that it's needed. So we had the support of all of the major sector bodies as well, which was crucial. We took an approach to refine, learn and improve. Anyone that's worked in an innovation environment will tell you that they didn't get everything right. And we absolutely did not get everything right in the development of the Value Toolkit. We did the best we could. We learned quickly where things didn't work. We tried to fix them quickly. But that refine, learn, improve mentality for anyone that wants to sort of take forward a new initiative or drive forward is key. The final one, which is the most challenging, I think, is to keep on top of emerging policy and to work with Treasury to seek alignment. Now, throughout the Value Toolkit's development, we were really fortunate to have the support of successive construction ministers, and for the Value Toolkit to be embedded in both the public and the private sector construction playbooks. And again, we were able to get that support from Treasury because equally Treasury acknowledged that there were points that could be improved and strengthened in alignment to the Green Book. So not completely separate to the Green Book, but in alignment to the steps in the Green Book. So if anyone's looking at a new initiative or a way to kind of drive forward some change in the sector, I'd come back to these 4 core things. And I think if they're core to your approach, you'll be able to hopefully drive some level of change. So very quickly walking you through the timeline behind the Value Toolkit. So we started with that industrial strategy. It was formally launched in 2019. And as part of that, UKRI was able to launch a Transforming Construction programme, which had lots of different initiatives funded within it. And the Value Toolkit was one of those initiatives. Between 2019 and 2020, we spent time developing the technical aspects, so the process behind the Value Toolkit. And we did that with a huge number of industry experts. So the way that we did that was that we looked at different aspects of value, and we pulled small working groups together to help guide that aspect. And then we also looked at different stages of value definition and measurement. So we broke down the Value Toolkit into different steps and had industry input into each of those steps. 2021 to 2022, we ran a pilot with 50 organisations who we trained how to use the Value Toolkit and got them up and running. And it was embedded in the construction playbook and the TIP roadmap at that point as well. There's the Transforming Infrastructure Performance roadmap, the IPA's roadmap to 2030. 2023 and 2024, we received a statement of support from Treasury, and the IPA agreed in principle to support the adoption of the Value Toolkit. And then in 2025, we've launched the Value Toolkit open source. Really fortunate that Constructing Excellence has provided a vehicle to do that. And that means that you can download, use any of the resources associated with the Value Toolkit. You can play with them, you can make them your own. There's no charge. All you have to do is, I think you have to register your details on the Constructing Excellence website to be able to access those materials. So that's the journey that we went on. And now what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the Value Toolkit itself, how it works, and just sort of talk you through the process and the different outputs that are involved in the Value Toolkit. So we talk a lot about value-led decision-making, delivering better outcomes, and often there's some slightly confused messaging around what that actually means. And so I guess the way that I found it easiest to describe what it means in the context of the Value Toolkit is that we focus on how an investment, particularly a built environment investment, can deliver better outcomes. And if it delivers better outcomes, it therefore delivers better value, rather than focusing all our efforts exclusively on delivering to the lowest possible price. And that's quite a change. And I say that as someone that works in this industry every day, that as a smaller consultancy tendering for opportunities, we still see that culture of lowest price first sort of prevails over the sector. So while we've made some progress, there's a really long way to go if we actually genuinely want to move away from a focusing primarily or sometimes only on lowest cost. So it was funded, the development was funded by UKRI, and the aim was to help clients deliver those better outcomes. And it really, I think the Value Toolkit does 3 things. It helps industry to consistently define and communicate what outcomes it wants to deliver for a built environment investment. It helps to measure that at key phases. So there's scorecards for design, for procurement, and then there's one for delivery, which essentially evaluates whether you did or didn't deliver what you were hoping to achieve. And the Value Toolkit can be used within projects, programs, and portfolios. It's easiest to apply to a project in an independent setting. I think it's probably more impactful if sort of used at a program or portfolio level, but there is less practice experience that I can point you to and say, well, here's where it's been done at a portfolio level. So you really will be a vanguard if you start using the Value Toolkit or any of its assets for managing portfolio investments. So really, if we think about sort of baking in outcomes into decision making, that starts with understanding what our strategic priorities are for an investment in the built environment. That very much aligns with the process that is embedded within the Green Book and business casing stage. And then critically, understanding how our investment aligns to those sort of strategic priorities, what sort of objectives we think we're going to be able to deliver. And then the most crucial bit for me, and I say this coming from years spent with a tier one contractor, is that we're not always great at translating what are very high level strategic objectives or benefit statements sometimes into what we actually want our design and delivery teams to do. And what we typically see is one of two things. The first is that sort of our design and delivery teams are given very high level statements without any guide or expectation. Very difficult to evidence that you've sort of delivered an improvement against. Or the second is that our design and delivery teams are given very specific things, outcomes to deliver, but they don't actually link or seemingly link to any of the strategic objectives and benefits that went into the business case. So either way, consistently we see there is a disconnect between setting high level objectives for a major investment and then actually connecting that as a line of sort of golden thread that runs through into what we're asking our design and delivery teams and our FM teams as well to do. So that thread is really what the Value Toolkit is there to do. Now, on the top of your screen, you'll see the kind of core steps, which are around how do you set those high-level strategic objectives? How do you then translate that into what you want your design and delivery teams to focus on? How do you know what success looks like? How are you going to measure whether you are actually delivering against those high-level objectives and outcomes all the way through your delivery? And the project scorecards are a way that you can do that to measure your performance. So that's the flow on the top. On the bottom are visual outputs that are created within the toolkit. Now, I've got to be honest, they're not quite as pretty as this. These are our graphics versions, but they're very similar to the visuals that you'll get if you download the spreadsheet tools that have been created to support the Value Toolkit. So let's go into each of those steps in a bit more detail. So the first step is about identifying what is strategically driving you as a project. And one of the really simple ways that you can do this is you can map the policy and strategy that's already been committed to at a national, regional and organisational level. So for example, if you are one of the new hospital programmes, you would be looking at what's been committed to by the new hospital programme. You'd be looking at what your local ICB is committed to in terms of delivering health outcomes. You'd probably be looking at policy and strategy from your local authorities, depending on where they sat. And then you'd look at what you as an organisation, as a trust, had committed to. So collectively, those things would be your strategic drivers. And you'd say, okay, we've got to respond to an awful lot of policy and strategy, but what are the consistent themes that occur time and time again across all of this policy and strategy? In essence, what am I already as a client committed to that needs to be reflected in this investment? And from that, you develop a series of high-level strategic objectives for the project. And out of this can flow other activity like your benefits mapping. But that kind of high level view of strategic objectives is really critical. And I've got to be honest, I thought in the beginning of this journey that the vast majority of multi-billion pound projects would have this. I just thought it would be standard. I thought it would be a really structured process. Actually, what we found through developing the Value Toolkit and through testing the Value Toolkit is that more often than not, those strategic objectives aren't clearly defined by the client side team, or if they are, they're developed and then left. And that thread of, okay, well, we've got these strategic objectives, but how do we know if anything that we're doing after writing our strategic objectives for our business case is helping to deliver or diminish those objectives, or a chance of success of delivering those objectives? That was really missing. So there's a process within the Value Toolkit for saying, okay, what are we already answerable to? How is this reflected in our objectives for this investment? And then the next stage is saying, okay, well, what kind of things can we do through this investment, through design and delivery that are evidence-based, that will directly help to lever against those strategic objectives? So again, joining or stitching the dots together. We're then going to prioritise and rationalise. So in every built environment project that I've worked in, the scale of ambition comparatively with the feasibility is always a point of challenge. The Value Toolkit doesn't say that a client can have absolutely every outcome that it would like to have. It follows a process of saying, okay, what are our strategic objectives? How can we do that through our design and delivery choices? And actually, what can we give on? So it might be that you end up with a list of outcomes that you want to deliver, but then you rationalise that down to focus on a core set of outcomes that you really think you can drive change around, rather than trying to tackle everything. Now, that conversation is critically important, because when you get into value engineering, as a client-side team or as client-side advisors, what you want to be able to do is say to the client, or work with the client to say to the client-side advisors, actually, this is an outcome that we cannot move on. We can move on these things, these outcomes can give a little bit, but we have defined that these outcomes are primary objectives for this project. So having that difficult discussion up front is really critical, because then the whole leadership team is really cognizant of the outcomes that need to be delivered and which of those can be moved on and which of those can't be moved on. Just moves that conversation forward rather than trying to have it in the design stages. Once you've got that, you can then say, okay, how will I go about measuring if these outcomes are being delivered through design and delivery? And that sets up your measures for success. You can then create a series of scorecards for different phases. I think it's really important to understand that not every outcome that you define can be influenced at every stage. There are some outcomes that will sit really well with the design and optioneering phase. And there are some outcomes that will sit really, really well with the delivery phase or the construction phase. And there are some that will sit between the two. But understanding that you can switch outcomes off and on is probably quite important for understanding when you can influence them. At that point, we would encourage you to check back against your strategic drivers and say again, are we meeting all of the boxes that we've been asked to? If Minister X knocks at my door and says, what are you doing to deliver against policy Y? We've got a really clear line of sight there. And then you can use the scorecards to help you evaluate value at different points and monitor performance through. The round on in the top right-hand corner, I think it would be the top right-hand corner of your screen, is the Value Toolkit's value profile. And I think that image has become fairly synonymous with the Value Toolkit. And what that shows is a client's different areas of value that they're trying to drive across a 4 capitals approach. And I'll talk you through that in a little bit more detail now. So if you remember, when we looked at the objectives that we were set for developing the Value Toolkit, there were 4 key objectives. And one of them was to develop a framework that helped people making investments in the built environment to consistently define value. Now, when we started on this journey, there was some confusion that I think everyone thought we were going to give them a view of what good value looked like. But as I said, that links very much to the investment that you're making and the context you're making it in. And so what we came up with the Value Toolkit was a framework for helping clients to understand where they could potentially drive better outcomes and what that looked like. Now, for the Value Toolkit, if you download any of the resources, you'll see this value definition framework embedded. It's a 4 capitals approach, and I'll run through the capitals in a little bit more detail. So there's the natural capital, and within that natural capital, you'll see that there's a definition, and then there's some different areas of value and that are called different categories of value, and then there's a description for each. So within the natural capital, it's everything you'd expect to see within an environmental focus: air, climate, use of resources, water, waste. And within the human capital, this is about employment and skills. So you would get things around employment, around skills. Within the social capital, it's about how we network, connect with each other. So there's a focus on inclusion around networks and connections in there, around people's ability to influence the process. And then the final capital is the produced capital, one we are really comfortable with in this built environment context. So that's the cost, quality, efficiency triangle that we see in every single project that we work in. And the idea is that by looking across these capitals, we're able to get a much more rounded definition of what good value looks like. Often when we look at objectives that are set for a project, they sit within that produced capital box. So cost, can we reduce cost? Can we improve service delivery? That kind of thing. By using the Value Toolkit, you can get a much more rounded view of what good outcomes could look like for a project. It's really important to say that you don't have to have outcomes against all of these categories. In fact, we would strongly discourage you from having outcomes against every single one of them. But it's a useful framework for guiding a conversation with a client to say, actually, where should we be focusing our efforts for this project? The value definition framework is never meant to be a kind of one-off, this is it for life. The aim is that as people use the Value Toolkit, we'll sort of invigorate the value definition framework because our view of value changes over time, and what might be a significant priority now might need to change over time. So, for example, in the development period that it took to develop the Value Toolkit, we saw that resilience, particularly that crossover between sort of a security factor for resilience, but also climate resilience, was really creeping up in terms of what people were thinking was important. So the idea is that this will be iterated over time. It's also important to say that if you already use a framework for defining value, so some people, I think in the water sector, quite often use 5 or 6 capital models. You might use kind of your pillars of environmental, social and governance. You might use any other kind of framework. You can still use the Value Toolkit, you'll just need to be able to tweak the resources and processes to align to whatever value definition framework you use. So the good news, the steps that I've talked you through, the process, the guidance, the spreadsheets that kind of walk you through that step by step are all available open source, and I've included the link, and I believe Maya very kindly will share all of the information with you after the session today. There are some bits of the Value Toolkit that have been tested and tested and tested, and there are other bits that are probably still at an earlier innovation stage. So it's worth just being sort of cognizant of that as you join and download any of the materials. As much as I can talk you through the steps that it goes through and the different outputs that you receive at different stages, without kind of killing you with PowerPoint slides, the best thing you can possibly do is just download the resources, have a play, and then there is a LinkedIn community that you can join that's got people like me that were involved in the technical process or the technical development, and we will help guide you, we'll provide advice, give you a nudge in the right direction once you've had a chance to have a play. Within the sort of Value Toolkit process, one of the questions that we get asked an awful lot is, oh, it's really complicated, isn't it? It's loads of steps and different outputs, and is that not a bit hard? And so I find the next 2 slides really helpful to show you, because this is how we, as Akerlof, would deliver the Value Toolkit client side. And broadly, that kind of value definition stage can be chunked in to two workshops settings. The first workshop setting is all about ensuring that the client understands what's driving their project, what policy, what strategy is really sitting behind their approach to that investment. It's also about helping them to define those strategic objectives and prioritise their strategic objectives as well. And then that second workshop is about saying, okay, so we've got very high level view of the objectives that we want to deliver against, but what outcomes are we asking for our design and delivery teams to focus on, and how are we going to bake that in? So that's the value definition side. And I will push back slightly on anyone that says, you know, if you're doing a multi-billion pound investment and you can't justify the time to run 2 good workshops to work out what it is that you're trying to achieve, then I'd probably push back on that quite hard, because I think anybody can do that. the application of the sort of development of the measurement framework that follows, and the application of the scorecards will take time outside that process. But bear in mind that these works, particularly workshop 1, can be delivered really early. It can be delivered either at kind of optioneering stage for a very kind of high level appraisal, REBA stage 1, and then you can kind of flow through the different steps of the value toolkit as you go into more detail. But you don't have to do everything at once. Those value definition workshops can be delivered in kind of 2 separate sessions. So when Dave and Hugo and I met yesterday, Dave said, can you give us an example of how it was used during the pilot? And I can. So I've got one here. There were quite a few. Most of them, and I'll be really transparent about this, focused on that. How do we define our strategic objectives and then our outcomes for our design and delivery teams? The latter stages of the value toolkit, how do we use it to measure, are much less well tested. But anyway, in terms of a case study, Network Rail ran 2 pilots of the Value Toolkit. One was for the Leeds Area Improvement Programme, and they were an outline business case. And what that programme was developed or designed to look at was 13 sets of relatively small infrastructure investments that helped to unlock wider system improvements. So relatively small kind of bits of work, but actually when they were joined together, they unlocked significant improvements. And what they wanted to use the Value Toolkit to do was to show a really clear line of sight between policy ambitions and the objectives and outcomes that could be delivered by that project. And then we worked with another team, the Waterside team, and they were developing their strategic outline case. And what they wanted support doing was to build some consensus and understanding around priority objectives and outcomes that could then be filtered into their benefits case. And really their main driver was to enhance their business case and have a really clear line of sight between policy, objectives, and what was actually being committed to in the benefits case. So over the course of a couple of months, each of these teams joined a couple of workshops, and we were able to identify their strategic objectives, their strategic drivers, so the policy that was driving their decision making, some priority objectives that would run across the investment, and also core set of outcomes to be focused on by the design and delivery teams. And that is one of the value toolkit, one of the value profiles that came out of that project. It's probably quite hard to see, but actually what we found in delivering the Network Rail pilots was that they often had quite a strong focus on equality and inclusion, ensuring that rail was accessible to the widest number of people. The feedback from both of the Network Rail clients was incredibly positive. They said it was great to have a complete set of a complete understanding of what was really driving their project and what they could focus on that could make a difference. And that it really helped to solidify the narrative for their business case process. And there are lots of other case studies. I think they're available on the Constructing Excellence webpage. I was involved in these 2 pilots, so it's for me to talk about them, but there's more examples available. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into how the Value Toolkit, particularly at the early stages, sort of defining value stages, can be used to help support the business case process. So I don't know if I can pause on this slide for long enough for you to read it, but the Value Toolkit received fairly consistent support across both the public and private sectors. This is a quote from Fergus Harradence, who's Deputy Director at Department of Business and Trade, who really was an advocate for the Value Toolkit and felt it could help, particularly in public sector investments, to drive better outcomes. And again, this is the crucial one. This is the support statement of alignment from Treasury to say that the Value Toolkit is a really powerful tool for helping to meet that what is a real gap on design and delivery and what we're asking those teams to do. At the moment, that's where we've got to in terms of Treasury support. Treasury are now going through a much more regular cycle of updating their guidance. So we're really hopeful that once the Value Toolkit is out there, it's being used more regularly, we'll be able to have some sort of link to that guidance, but that's a little way off yet. But for now, for anyone that is public sector side or working with public sector clients, rest assured that you can use the Value Toolkit and know that it's been through all of the kind of checks and balances to ensure that it kind of aligns with what government is trying to deliver and achieve. Hopefully I've talked for long enough for you to be able to read that one now. So, lessons learned. So there are definitely some lessons if any of you are in the process of doing something really innovative. And actually we've worked with some other organisations that have been looking to drive change to see what steps that they took. And you can see that these are quite consistent. So there is a big message which is around bringing everyone on a journey, kind of learning together, failing together and then fixing together. And I think I'm really proud that that's something that I think we managed to achieve through the Value Toolkit. We captured people's imaginations. I think as a sector, we're full of people that really want to deliver better outcomes. And so that was all we're already pushing on an open door. I think the second thing that we learned was that alignment to policy and existing practice is key. I am sure that there are probably people in the audience that will be able to call out and say, well, does it align to this and does it align to that? Hopefully the answer to most of those things will be yes. I'm sure there will be something that's emerged over the last sort of year to 6 months that we might not fully align with. But that constant work to work with other stakeholders to align what you're developing with what already exists as great practice, I think is really important. We built a lot of positive relationships across both public and private sector organisations. It really felt like we were working together to try and fix a very well-known problem. In terms of what we could have done better or learned that I didn't know in starting out of this journey, the most obvious thing is that if you're designing anything for government to adopt, designing it to government standards is your baseline position. Now, it sounds ridiculous because we looked at all of the policy, we made sure we were really aligned to kind of the policy and visions, but the actual mechanics of how the tools within the Value Toolkit worked, ensuring that they meet design standards, particularly if you're developing any digital resources that they align to sort of government's digital inclusion policies, is absolutely critical. Now, I feel a little bit silly saying that. You would think it would be something that you'd absolutely check inside out, and we did from a policy perspective, but from the mechanics perspective, I'd really encourage you to do that, particularly if you're developing any digital tools. Make sure that you're aligning with all of government's best practice standards. Apart from anything else, they are really good, and we actually as Ackleoff use them quite a lot because they set a really good standard. And then the final thing that I don't think I'd realised it to the extent, but industry support is really critical to unlocking government support. So government listen to industry, they listen to organisations like the APM, like the CLC, and so actually if your aim is to drive change in the public sector, you will really, really need to focus on making sure that the private sector is behind you. And the final, I guess, lesson is to design, iterate and improve, but don't stop. We had a period in kind of last year where progress just stopped for lots of different reasons, for really good reasons, but you lose momentum. So while you've got that momentum, I'd encourage you to keep pushing forward and keep going. So I'll close out this session now, but as I do that, I'd encourage you just to read this text from the top to the bottom and then read it from the bottom up again. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into how the Value Toolkit was developed, where it came from, why it was felt it was necessary to develop the Value Toolkit, but also the practical steps that were within the Value Toolkit and some of the resources that are available to you now. So lots of the things that I shared today, those visual outputs, the spreadsheet, you can download those, they're open source and free to use. So I'd really encourage you to have a crack at them. I think I can pause and take breath, hand over to Dave and Hugo, but I really hope that's been useful for you.
That's been absolutely fantastic, Ellie. That's a really excellent explanation of, apart from anything else, just how difficult it is, how long it takes to do the job properly. It's very easy to do something and think you're right and then find nobody's with you because you didn't spend enough time working with the stakeholders. I'm really interested in what you think are the obstacles to implementing it, particularly implementing it across a portfolio. But let's start with the basic obstacles to implementing the toolkit and then talk about the portfolio.
I think if you've not had a crack at doing it, it can feel quite hard. I think like anything, you will. There is a risk that people will leave the call today. They'll open up the flex standard, the guidance. They'll open up the spreadsheets and they'll go, "Oh, wow, it's actually quite hard to define outcomes properly, isn't it?" What I would really encourage you to do is not stop at that point. But if you are working client side, run a test. So consultant organisations, one of the really positive things that I saw consultant organisations do is take one of their projects and internally within their consultant organisation, not directly with their client, but run the Value Toolkit process internally to see how it works. And that built their confidence. It then meant that they could go and talk to clients about it effectively and run those workshops with a bit more confidence. So I'd definitely encourage you to do that. So do a couple of internal tests, access the network as well. So there is a community of people that are willing to help for free, to give you a bit of a support and a nudge in the right direction. Call on them, call on me. If you open it and you get a bit stuck, then definitely go to, there's lots of us that have worked on the Value Toolkit and are more than willing to give you a hand in the right direction.
I think you said one of the key obstacles was defining strategic objectives, which is probably a great deal. Once you've got the strategic objectives, everything flows from there, but without them, it's very difficult to make them flow. If we then take that up a level to portfolio, where we're trying to define the strategic objectives for the portfolio, for the whole of the client purpose, for UK government, what does the UK government want? Do you think that then creates a problem that actually we're not sure what we want?
I think we change our mind on what we want quite a lot. But I think if we have a portfolio of investments, and where I see this would work really well is with local authorities that have a kind of a portfolio of investments to make in their estate. The Value Toolkit can't really be used to say, well, what you should definitely do is invest in investment A and not in investment B. That's not what it was designed for. But actually, I think if we set those strategic objectives at a portfolio level, we can then get a much clearer view that not every investment has to meet every single one of those strategic objectives. Some might meet one of your strategic objectives completely and really drive forward your approach to reducing embodied carbon or whatever it is, whereas another might be really focused on improving the social inclusion of your assets. And that's fine. I think if we can get the Value Toolkit to work at a portfolio level in a way that helps clients to understand that not every single investment has to achieve everything, but if we can get our portfolio investments to work to achieve different things, then the sum of the parts is much better. So yeah, I'd love to see that happen. I think there's loads of scope to manage that more effectively. The reality is I know that lots of the clients that we're working with are struggling to go through that process at a project level. So to kind of aggregate it up to a program level is a bigger challenge, and then to portfolio even more.
And just to round out the portfolio question, one of the key challenges that I found with benefits management, with value management, and I expect it's the same for the toolkit, is how do you manage things at a portfolio level when you have only got, say, 18 of Network Rail's projects assessed through the Value Toolkit, so the vast bulk of the projects aren't assessed? How do you then say we can prioritize when you've got a whole lot of unknowns that you can't prioritize against?
I think that's really challenging. I think that's where the process element of the Value Toolkit comes into play. So you can't define everything up front, but if you follow a consistent process for how you do define it, that will certainly help you. What doesn't help is where you take an independent process every time you try to evaluate different investments. That's not going to help you deliver better outcomes. So in a land where we don't know everything, and we often don't know everything, if you can follow one consistent process, and I know there's brilliant guidance on this within the benefits standard as well, then I think that will really help. Take a process-led approach rather than trying to do everything when you just don't have that knowledge to hand.
So Ellie, questions are starting to fly in. In fact, someone wants a job with Akerlof, so watch out on your LinkedIn account. I think they're reaching out to you. That's a good job there. Alex from Emborn has asked, does the toolkit only work effectively at scale, or can it still be implemented on an individual project basis, say, a fit-out project as opposed to a portfolio or full lifecycle scheme? Thoughts?
Okay, it's a really interesting question. So typically with the Value Toolkit, what we've said is that it works best for projects of scale. So it works best if you've got a project that is typically over, I don't know, say for argument's sake, say about 10 million. That said, I had a really interesting conversation on another webinar that I ran recently, which had a tier one contractor on it, and they'd been brought in to do a relatively small fit out project and realised that the client had defined some objectives, but then hadn't actually set anything in motion to deliver against those. And the path that they were on was not going to deliver against any of those objectives. In fact, it was going to really fail. They used the Value Toolkit to have a really sensible discussion with their client to say, actually, you set these objectives, but actually what you're asking for isn't going to deliver those objectives. Are you aware of that? Now, that did mean that the client had to go back and look at some of their designs and rework some of them. But actually, they said, and this is from them, not from me, that the Value Toolkit enabled them to have that structured conversation and then help their client to deliver much better outcomes. So typically, I'd say at scale, it's better. It's easier to justify the time, but there will absolutely be applications where it can be used on different projects, and it's by far the easiest to deliver at a project level.
And just a small tag on to that, another question that's coming from Maritha, if I've got the name right, from Binny's. This is where in the journey would be best, most efficient moment or stage to incorporate innovation?
Innovation, okay. So the way the Value Toolkit works is those high level objectives are set, and then the client will go about setting some outcomes for its design and delivery team. Now, one of the critical things for the outcomes that are set is that they are solution agnostic. So you're not telling a client you need to, an outcome is that you go and use MMC to deliver that. That's not an outcome. That's not an outcome. That's you dictating. But you might say something like, we need you to expedite delivery and have a quality is critically important to us. Now, design and delivery side, that's the perfect moment to innovate, because you go back to your client and say, you're saying you're trying to drive an outcome around X. We think this might be the right solution. So the whole idea of the Value Toolkit is that it's not prescriptive on the solution that's delivered. It enables that conversation between client and design and delivery teams to say, right, client, you've set these outcomes. Our industry knowledge will tell us this is the best way that you might be able to deliver them. So the whole point is that you're able to have some discussion and embed innovative solutions that will really meet the client's needs. Again, there's a bit of a cultural journey to go on then. So the immediate pushback, if there are any contractors in the room, will be, well, we don't get into the conversation early enough. So appreciate that there are some other factors that go in and around that. But yes, the point at which clients defined their outcomes for the design and delivery teams is the point at which you can really drive that innovation.
Thank you very much. If a project is already underway, is there still an opportunity to bring the toolkit in?
So it depends what stage, I'd say. In terms of my experience of delivering the Value Toolkit, once you're getting past REBA 3, it's hard to kind of step back and kind of reshape what's trying to be delivered by that project. Definitely works better at the earlier stages. That said, if you're on a project that you think is on a fast track to not delivering against what was in the business case or what you'd hoped would be delivered, we have been brought in by clients to almost do a stop check, and it's run more as a kind of a check and challenge exercise rather than a kind of vision shaping, objective shaping using through the scorecard. But the earlier you can use it, the better, and then you can bake it in at each of your key decision points. I need to get much better. I'm not very concise at answering questions. Sorry. I will try harder.
Absolutely perfect. It's fascinating and delightful to hear it explained at length. It does need to be explained at length sometimes. Emma asks, would you recommend always using a third-party facilitator to run the workshops in order to get the best out of groups?
So I don't know where Emma comes from, but the Value Toolkit can be facilitated by anyone. So in my experience, Architects are really good at facilitating those workshops because they come from kind of a collaborative design background. We've seen most of the major consultancies have a crack at running those workshops as well. If you're client side, if Emma's client side, then it might be worth having someone independent to run that session for you if budget allows. If budget doesn't allow, then there's nothing to say that you can't run that workshop yourself, but you'll just need to be conscious of any tensions that already exist and how you might mitigate those. So one of the things that we've seen is that sometimes if those workshops are set up and there is a particularly dominant leader in the room, it's quite helpful to have a third party that can help to navigate that. It's harder for an internal team to do, but it's absolutely possible.
Yes, absolutely. Can program or project risks be incorporated into the work you do in the Value Toolkit and the workshops, or is that already part of the process?
So there is a whole risk stream to the Value Toolkit that the resources can be downloaded. It's factored in through the kind of the risk of not delivering against those objectives and outcomes. But there are lots of other very clear risk processes that I think you would use on any kind of project or program that would align to the Value Toolkit. So I'm not sure I would advise you to run an entirely separate risk process for the Value Toolkit.
There's a question asking what have been the main limitations to apply to the toolkit, and in particular in relation to scorecards.
So I think the scorecards are the bit of the Value Toolkit that's been least tested, and I think they need more work to test them effectively. So that value definition bit is, I could give you that tomorrow, you'd be away, and it would massively help with the front end. In terms of how the Value Toolkit is used, particularly during procurement, there is a guidance note that was written by Trowers and Hamlin, I think, to guide how the Value Toolkit could be used in procurement. So the guidance exists, but the practical application of that guidance has been less well tested. So in terms of what are the exact limitations of using those scorecards, I think we're yet to see some of those limitations. I think one of the key limitations that we've seen to date is that it's a change in process. So it requires working in a different way, and that takes clients on a bit of a journey in terms of the application of the scorecards. What works really well about the scorecards is that typically when we look to procure against different social outcomes, different environmental outcomes, they're very much siloed. So there's a question on carbon, there's a question on different social factors, there's a question within the technical envelope. What the Value Toolkit does is it has a points-based system that enables you to score against any outcomes, and it doesn't matter whether they relate to quality or relate to social value, because that points-based system enables you to look at different outcomes and compare them in the same way. I think that's really exciting, a bit different.
So I think we're nearing the end of the session, so we're not going to get through all the questions, I fear. So we might need to come back to a few people afterwards. So I'm going to take the opportunities while I've got the floor to ask a question for myself. Can you slice and dice this and just take the best bits and apply it to any given project, or is it a sort of one size fits all product?
So that I will give you my honest answer. There are other people on the technical team who will curse me for saying this, but this is where the contractor in me comes out, Dave. From a pragmatic perspective, even if you just take one section of the Value Toolkit and it improves your process, then crack on and do that. You know, the Value Toolkit was developed using public money. So if the best way for you to use it is just to use the scorecards or just to use the value definition framework, then do that. And if you need to tweak it or you know, it's all in kind of spreadsheet format, so there's nothing to say that you can't have a play with it and develop it and align it to your own systems, I'd encourage you to do that. Just make the best use of it that you can. I've got no issue with that at all.
So one last question and then I'll close. Can the toolkit be adopted by sectors other than construction?
Okay, interesting question. So typically, it was developed for the built environment, so it depends what they mean specifically by construction, but it's been used in water, in aviation. I imagine in most regulated sectors it would be a useful tool to apply, but more broadly, like I don't think it's ever been tested in kind of FMCG or fashion or anything else. So I couldn't give you an explicit answer. It's definitely been developed for a kind of built environment or infrastructure context. If someone does want to give it a go and see how it works in a really different or interesting sector, then give me a shout. I'd love to find out how it works. But yeah, defence, water, energy, it will work pretty well, I think.
Yes, I mean it's a robust process with basic principles in there that could be reapplied. I think there are there are other frameworks which you have aligned with and taken into account. So in simple terms, yes, it can be used, but also so could other frameworks be used in different environments. I really like to follow up by saying thank you very much for this fantastic talk, for the first talk for the built environment, and obviously one of many for benefits and value, because we're getting old. You can just look at me and see that. Just a reminder that being a member of APM opens up all sorts of opportunities for people. So do consider, if you aren't already a member, do consider joining. Do follow up on the events page to see all the other webinars that are coming up. There are lots, and also the face-to-face events in regional networks where you can meet people and make yourself useful and make yourself available to people. So as a final roundup, thank you very much to Ellie. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and lots of virtual hands ups going up, Ellie. So great stuff. Thanks for spending your time with us. Thank you, everyone.